Hello, and welcome back to My Idea Way. I'm Hayden, and today I want to talk about a business story that's pretty much a story about letting go. And I mean the wording of that in a specific way, not quitting something because it failed, not walking away once the results are too bad to defend, letting go of something while it's still working, because that's a harder thing to do than in all those other things. Because most people and most companies can change once the evidence has piled up to the point where staying the same is embarrassing. What's rare is a willingness to question the thing that's still making you successful. Well, it's paying the bills and while it's earning you praise. That's what makes Reed Hastings and Netflix worth one entire episode, I think. Netflix didn't become Netflix by finding one good model and defending it forever. It became Netflix by repeatedly moving away from the version of the company that had just worked. DVDs by mail, then streaming, then original content, then something closer to a global entertainment platform. And underneath every one of those shifts was the same idea. A company shouldn't be built only to protect what it already is. It should be built to become whatever the future actually needs, even when that means dismantling the thing that currently works and you're currently proud of. That sounds almost counterintuitive when you say it out loud. Of course, companies need to adapt. Of course, technology changes. Of course, the future doesn't care how well your current model works, but you should probably stick with things that work. There's always the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But in practice, I think adaptation is one of the hardest things an organization can do, because the thing you need to let go of is the exact thing that made you matter in the first place. The old model has customers who like it. It has revenue that funds everything else. It has employees who understand it deeply and built careers around that thing of understanding it. It has systems. It has habits. It has an identity wrapped up in the story which the company tells itself. This is who we are. This is how we win. This is what we're good at. Changing that story can't just be a strategic decision. It's almost a matter of the identity of the company itself. And identity problems are much harder to solve with the numbers and the metrics than a strategy problem is. That's why most successful companies actually fail at some point. Not because nobody inside of it saw the future coming and wasn't able to adapt to it. Almost every single time a company has failed, someone saw that possible future of failure. It's that the present that they were in was too profitable, too familiar, too comfortable, and they couldn't leave it in time. What actually makes Reed Hastings interesting to me, though, is that Netflix, instead of waiting until the end, kept trying to leave early, with real mistakes and arrogance along the way, but still operating like the biggest danger wasn't failure. The bigger danger was becoming too attached to one kind of success. That's the question I think I want to sit with for this whole episode. How do you really build a person, a team, a company that can change before reality forces it to? And also, what does a company that reinvented itself 3 separate times actually teach us about freedom, responsibility, culture, what it costs to stay adaptable on purpose? And to understand that, I want to start with Hastings' story. Originally, Hastings wasn't an entertainment guy at all. He studied math, he was in the Peace Corps, he worked in software before any of this. He ran a company called Pure Software before Netflix, and that company grew fast in the way that some successful startups do, which meant it also picked up rules, processes, layers, the way startups do at the same time. At first, everyone knows what's going on and moves fast because the culture is informal in a startup by necessity. Then the company grows, someone abuses that flexibility, something breaks, and the leadership adds rules to prevent that break from happening again. Then another exception happens, so another rule gets added, then a policy, then an approval process, then a manager whose entire job is enforcing that process. Eventually, the company is safer in one sense, but slower, less creative, less attractive to the kind of person who could go work anywhere. Hastings came out of that experience with an almost allergic reaction to unnecessary rules. And he wanted Netflix to be built differently from the start, around trust rather than around control, around hiring people strong enough that constant supervision was unnecessary. That became one of the basic ideas in Netflix's culture: freedom and responsibility. And I think that pairing of freedom and responsibility matters in a lot more than either word on its own does in culture, if that makes sense. Freedom without responsibility is chaos. Responsibility without freedom is like a bureaucracy, which is basically what pure software turned into. Netflix became famous, maybe most famous, for having almost no formal vacation policy. And on the surface, that reads like a perk an employer might give you, some nice line on the recruitment page. But the actual idea underneath it is a statement about trust that goes a lot deeper than just having whatever time off you need. If you hire adults, you treat them like adults. And if a specific person can't be trusted to make a reasonable decision about a few days off, the real problem isn't the vacation policy, it's who got hired or how they're being managed in the first place. This is where Hastings' whole philosophy gets super interesting to me, because I think that most companies build their rules around the average case, or perhaps even the worst case. They ask, what if someone takes advantage of this? What if someone asks selfishly? And then they write their policy to prevent that worst behavior from happening. The problem is that that policy also restricts everyone who wasn't going to abuse it in the first place. And it tells your most responsible and therefore most productive people that they're being managed as if they were the exception you're worried about. Hastings tried to flip that notion entirely. Instead of designing the company to prevent bad behavior from mediocre performers, he designed it to enable excellent behavior from the actually capable people that would do the best work for his company. That's an amazing shift, I think, because it's a completely different starting point. And it explains everything else about how Netflix operated. Design around mistrust, and you end up with a rule book, because rules are easy to write down and easy to enforce. Design around trust, and you need judgment instead. And judgment is so much harder to build because it requires communication, an understanding of a goal, and it requires leaders who can actually tolerate not controlling every single detail themselves. This connects to what became, at some point, one of Netflix's most repeated internal phrases: context, not control. The job of leadership isn't to make every decision, it's to give people enough context that they can make good decisions on their own without needing to be told. A controlling leader would say, I know what needs to happen, so I'll tell you exactly what to do. A context-driven leader says, here's the strategy, here's what matters, here's the info I have, here's what we're trying to achieve, now use your judgment. Context creates alignment without making the leader be present for every single call. And it changes the weight emotionally of the work too. If you're told exactly what to do and it fails, you can point to the instruction. If you're given context and freedom instead, you own the outcome, which is not a comfortable trade for people who want protection from ambiguity. Netflix wanted the opposite kind of person, though. A person who could operate inside a system with ambiguity, make a real decision, take real feedback, and adjust to that feedback without needing to rely on a script from an employer. That's actually one of the first big lessons buried in this story, and I think it needs a while to really understand it. Freedom isn't an absence of pressure. It can increase pressure because it hands you more ownership over what happens next. A lot of people say they want freedom, but when they actually want is freedom without the weight of choice attached to it. They want room to decide without having to really carry what the decision costs if it's wrong. Netflix's culture forces that connection whether you like it or not. You get freedom, but you have to be worthy of it. And I think that idea goes a lot further than the business world. In school, people constantly want more independence, less oversight, fewer people checking their work. But independence only works if you can actually manage yourself when nobody's checking. If no one's forcing you to study, you have to be the one who decides to. Freedom exposes exactly how much structure you have, which is a scary thing to find out, I think, about yourself. And it's part of why a lot of structure, as limiting as structure can feel, is also protective. Take the structure away and you find out pretty quickly whether your own standards were ever real or not. None of this works, though, without what Netflix called talent density, which is the piece of the model that gets left out whenever people try and copy it somewhere else. Talent density isn't just about having a few smart people scattered around. It's about having a team where most people are strong enough that the whole environment changes shape because of it. People move faster because they trust each other. They need fewer rules because that judgment that the talent density provides is reliable, they give sharper feedback because the work matters to them. Freedom and responsibility only function at all if talent density is high, because otherwise removing rules doesn't produce creativity, it produces confusion. And that dependency is why the culture became controversial. Netflix wanted to keep what it called stunning colleagues and used something called the keeper test, where a manager privately asks whether they'd fight to keep someone if that person were thinking about leaving. If the honest answer was no, the company often decided to fire that person. That's an intense thing, I think. And I don't think it's fair to admire it without seeing the bad parts of it too. On one hand, the logic part of it tracks. You can't combine unlimited trust with tolerance for weak performance because the whole system depends on judgment being reliable across the board. On the other hand, that level of pressure to perform can make people feel replaceable, which can create hum anxiety, which can turn work into something that is closer to a constant audition instead of a place you can belong. I think this is one of the most useful tensions in the whole Hastings story because it means Netflix's culture isn't just give people freedom and watch everything improve. It's freedom paired with an extremely demanding view of performance. And that pairing empowers people who thrive on autonomy and directness, and it wears down on people who need more stability. That doesn't make the model wrong, though. It just means, like every culture, it has a cost. And no culture can actually maximize every good thing at once. A culture built for speed sacrifices patience. A culture built for harmony sacrifices honesty. A culture built for creativity sacrifices consistency. Netflix chose freedom, responsibility, talent density, candor, and that combination created a company that could move fast, but that wasn't really made for everybody. And I think that movement is the center of this story because the culture that Netflix had wasn't just an internal philosophy. It was actually in service of a strategy that had to keep changing shape. Netflix started it as DVDs by mail, which at the time was a clever improvement on the alternative of driving to a video store and risking returning your movie late and getting a late fee. That alone would have been a great business to sell into, but Hastings and the team could see that mailing physical discs wasn't going to be the final form of anything, that the internet would at some point get fast enough for videos to stream. And once that happened, shipping plastic discs through the mail would be almost a terrible business. This is exactly the point where most companies stall out. They can see the future clearly, but the old business is still paying everyone's salary, so they tell themselves that the new tech isn't ready yet, or customers aren't ready yet, or the margins still might be better in the old model, and that they'll get to it later. The later part is I think, the most dangerous part here, because by the time the shift becomes undeniable, somebody else may already own that shift. Andy Grove and Intel went through almost the exact structural moment, just in a different industry. Intel had built its whole identity on memory chips, and when the world started to shift, Grove and Gordon Moore asked himself a question that stuck with me since I first read about it when I was researching Intel. If the board fired us and brought in new leadership, what would those new leaders do? They both realized almost immediately that a fresh set of leaders with no emotional attachment to the memory business would probably abandon it and move to microprocessors. So Grove asked the obvious follow-up, why don't we just do that ourselves? Because before, we're forced to do that. That question is one of the more useful tools I've come across in any of these episodes because it puts you outside of your own attachment to the past, and it puts you in the position of the person responsible for the company's future. Netflix operated on a version of that same instinct, I think. If a brand new company were trying to beat Netflix from scratch right now, would it build a DVD mailing operation? Obviously not. So Netflix had to become its own disruptor before someone else did it for them. And I think that's the center lesson of this whole episode. If you're not willing to make your current model obsolete yourself, someone else will do it for you. That idea travels a long way in business. A long way past business. A student who only relies on study habits that worked in an easier class can get exposed and get a bad grade the moment the material gets harder. An athlete who's only ever won through raw physical advantages can struggle badly once everyone else's bodies are the same as theirs and technique matters more. Success creates habits, and some of those habits stay useful while others are traps to some extent. And the whole difficulty here is telling which is which before it becomes a problem, a bigger problem than just having a bad habit is. What's easy to miss about Netflix, though, is that it wasn't one dramatic pivot that they made and then just settled into. A lot of companies make a big shift and then get attached to it as attached to it as they were to the old one. Netflix just kept going. In their move to streaming, the company was pretty much just distributing licensed content that it didn't own. And that worked great for a while, but there was an obvious problem sitting inside of it. If streaming was the future, then studios and networks that owned all the content would eventually want their own platforms instead of handing over their stuff to Netflix. So Netflix had to change again, from being a distributor to becoming a creator, investing heavily in original shows and movies that it actually owned. That's actually an enormous shift in capability in the company itself. It's not just a strategy change. They had to develop logistics, tech, licensing, creative development, global production, marketing. All of it had to be built from scratch on top of a company that had just finished building an entirely different set of capabilities for the previous version of itself. That's the sense in which Netflix kept letting go of the last version of itself. Not all at once, not without mistakes, but directionally. Over and over again, in a way that almost no organization has done more than once in a row, if that makes sense. This is a rare thing because organizations have something close to an immune system built into them by default. There are people who say, that's not how we do things here. There are processes designed around the old model, metrics that reward the old behavior, leaders whose entire status comes from having mastered that old system, employees whose skills are tied specifically to the old system, and customers who like the old product. All of that adds up to a real resistance in the company, which means adaptation isn't rational to some extent. It's a fight against a company's own internal systems. And culture is a big part of whether that fight can actually be won, I think. A culture built around rules and protecting the past struggles to move quickly just by design. A culture built around context, talent, candor has a fighting chance. None of this means that Netflix got it all right, and I think it's worth being honest about the failures, because a story with no mistakes in it is not a good lesson, I think. The most famous one is probably Quickster, when Netflix tried to split its DVD business off into a separate brand from streaming. Customers hated it. The rollout was confusing, it became a genuine public embarrassment, and Netflix reversed course within weeks. I think it matters because it shows the danger sitting in the same mentality that made the company strong in the first place. The willingness to disrupt yourself is good. Confusing the people you actually serve while you're doing it isn't. And some visionary leaders who are so locked on to where the world is headed forget where their customers actually are right now, like today. The future matters, obviously, but customers live in the present. And good strategy has to build a bridge between the two instead of just announcing a destination and expecting everyone to catch up to it. Netflix learned from that, though. The direction towards streaming stayed the same. Quickster itself just disappeared. And that's its own lesson worth holding on to. A company or a person can be wrong about the execution and still be right about the direction. People tend to judge a whole strategy by whatever immediate consequences or public outrage it produces, but sometimes the insight is good and completely real, and the move itself was just the bad part, or clumsy even, or badly timed, or maybe just not explained to the customer as well. This is where I like to connect this back to Amy Edmondson's research, because psychological safety exists specifically so problems can surface early instead of after they've already become public failures. Netflix leaned hard into candor as a cultural value. The idea that people should say what they actually think, not privately after the meeting ends, not months later once it's too late to matter, but directly in the room while it still matters and can change something. Candor speeds up learning, because a weak idea that goes unchallenged for 6 months is a lot more expensive than a weak idea that gets challenged on day one. But candor is also kind of dangerous the moment it spoils into something closer to cruelty. And I think that's one of the real problems sitting inside the Netflix model that doesn't get talked about enough. Direct feedback can absolutely sharpen performance. Delivered without any care behind it, though, that exact same directness is harsh, political, exhausting to live by, I think. And there's a difference between telling the truth because the work matters and using I'm just being honest, like the phrase I'm just being honest, as a cover for being rude and careless. The best version of candor is truth aimed at the work. The worst version is ego wearing candor as a disguise. And I think that almost everyone has had enough experience with both that they understand that there's a huge difference between the two. Netflix's culture pushed hard towards openness because Hastings believed genuinely great people want to improve and don't actually want to be protected from information that holds them up or doesn't let them get better at what they do. But that only holds up if there's enough underlying trust for the feedback to land as help instead of an attack. Without trust, candor's like an assault. With trust, it can be kind of like respect in a way, being taken seriously enough to be told the truth. The exact same sentence, this part of the project is weak, can land differently depending on whether you believe the person saying it wants to help you or it just wants to tear something down. And I think that's why candor and psychological safety honestly have to travel together. A culture can be candid and unsafe, where people say hard things constantly, but everyone feels threatened by them all the time. A culture can be safe but not candid. People are being supportive on the surface. Well, nobody actually ever says the hard thing that needs to be said. Netflix leaned further into candor than I think most companies, and for that matter, most people would be comfortable with. And I think that that's part of why it stayed so adaptable. But it also means that the culture asks a lot of people emotionally. You have to be able to hear feedback without collapsing under it. You have to be able to give feedback without turning it into something personal. You have to detach your sense of self from your ideas well enough that the criticism of the idea doesn't feel like a criticism of you. I think this is where Hastings' whole model isn't just a business framework anymore, and it's more like a personal mentality. Can you build enough internal security that criticism is registered as information instead of an attack? Can you hear the truth about something before the consequences actually force it on you? And I think that's one of the most valuable ideas that's buried under the whole Netflix story, because the faster you can metabolize a hard truth, the faster you get to improve, whether that's company, a team, or just an individual person. Obviously, not all criticism is correct, and not everyone offering feedback actually understands what you're trying to do. But if you reject everything uncomfortable on reflex, you cut yourself off from a huge chunk of reality and advice that you probably actually need. There's another piece of Netflix's culture that I think gets misread, honestly, which is Netflix's decision to describe itself explicitly as a professional sports team instead of a family. A lot of companies love the family metaphor because it's warm, it implies loyalty and unconditional belonging, and you don't cut your sibling loose because their numbers drop this quarter. A sports team runs on something different. Contribution toward a shared goal, real care and trust, but there's also standards there, roles that shift, and a willingness to change the roster to field the strongest possible group. I think that this metaphor explains a lot about why Netflix's culture reads both as admirable in a way and also as cold, depending on who you ask. It creates clarity and can produce excellence, but it can also produce a kind of sense that your spot on the team is never fully guaranteed. Every metaphor a company chooses for itself comes with its own failure, I think. The family metaphor can create real loyalty, but it can also let people tolerate bad performance because holding a real standard starts to feel disloyal to your family members. The team metaphor creates clarity and drive, but it can also leave people feeling more replaceable than they'd like to be. Neither one is really correct. The useful move is asking what the work requires. And I think Netflix picked the team metaphor because its business needed speed, sharp judgment, and adaptation. A hospital or a school or a small family business might need a completely different balance, which is why copying Netflix's culture wholesale, just because it sounds impressive or works well for them, would probably be a mistake without asking what specific problem that culture was built to solve in the first place. I think the question, what problem is this culture solving, is worth sitting with, I think. Netflix's culture was solving very specific problems. How do you move fast in an industry that keeps changing underneath you? How do you avoid slow bureaucratic layers as the company scales? How do you give genuinely talented people room to do their best work? How do you keep standards high without a rulebook? How do you make sure a weak idea gets challenged before it wastes a year of everyone's time? If your actual problems look different from that list, your culture probably needs to look a little different too, which gets at something I think is underrated here. That culture is really just strategy translated into how people are expected to behave day to day. If your strategy needs innovation, but your culture quietly punishes failure, the culture is going to win that fight. If your strategy needs long-term thinking, but everyone's evaluated purely on their short-term numbers, then obviously culture wins again. Netflix's strategy needed constant adaptation. So nearly every piece of the culture, the freedom, the talent density, the candor, the context over control, was built to support that one requirement. And the coherence between all those pieces is what made the entire thing work as well as it did, not any one piece being good on its own. That coherence is rarer than it sounds in business because a lot of organizations end up incoherent in some ways. They say they want creativity and then require 6 layers of approval for putting anything new into the company. They say they want honesty and then punish anyone who brings bad news. They say they want teamwork and then reward individual visibility. A coherent culture means the stated values, the actual incentives, and the real day-to-day behavior all point at least roughly in the same direction. And I think that that's the real reason Netflix's internal culture document spread as widely as it did once it became public. It wasn't because, or sorry, it was because it wasn't full of the usual vague corporate language. Words like integrity, excellence, that mean almost anything you want them to mean. It said what the company actually wanted, with actual edges to it, actual costs attached. Freedom meant some people would misuse it and have to leave. Candor meant real discomfort on a regular basis. Talent density meant pressure. That's honestly a decent test for whether any stated value is real or just decoration. Does it ever cost you something when there's an actual trade-off on the table? If a value never costs anything, it's pretty much just brand. I think that test works well on a personal level too, honestly. And I think it's worth turning inward. People say that they value growth, but do they actually go looking for honest feedback, or do they avoid the people most likely to give it? People say they value health, but do they actually protect their sleep when something more fun is on the table? People say they value truth, but do they actually admit it out loud when they were wrong about something, or do they just update and move on without saying anything? A value only becomes real the moment it costs you something that you'd rather keep. Now, the customer side of Netflix's story matters just as much as the internal culture side, in my opinion, because culture and strategy only really exist to serve someone outside the company. Netflix understood early that what people really wanted was convenience, choice, a sense of control over their own time. And the old video rental model was full of a kind of, I think friction's a good word for it, that everyone had just accepted as normal. You had to physically go somewhere, you had to hope that the movie you wanted was in stock, you had to remember to return it or get charged a fee that was a little unfair. Netflix removed that friction, first with mail delivery, then with a subscription model that killed late fees, then with a streaming model that removed physical delivery from the equation altogether. I think that's a useful way to think about innovation in general, because a lot of it isn't inventing some totally new desire that nobody's ever had before in life. It's noticing what friction people have with their best products and removing that friction. Amazon, for example, didn't invent shopping. It made buying things easier. Uber didn't invent the idea of getting a ride from a stranger. It just removed the friction of getting one. Spotify didn't invent music. It removed the friction around accessing it. Netflix looked at entertainment and asked the same basic question. What friction here is normal because nobody sticks to it yet? Once people experience the easier version of something, their tolerance for that old friction pretty much disappears, which is, I think, on the other side of the equation, a dangerous dynamic for people who build their businesses around the old friction being acceptable. Customers can tolerate inconvenience for years without complaint until they experience something that's better that doesn't have the same friction. That's part of why Netflix's early bet, I think, mattered so much. It kind of reset what people expected from the entertainment industry entirely. The whole industry had to catch up to the expectations that Netflix had created. Though, I think it's worth being honest that this shift didn't end up with a simple improvement. The streaming world eventually fragmented into dozens of different subscriptions and libraries, which brought a lot of, I think, the same friction back in a new form, just spread across more streaming services than concentrated in a video store. That's a pattern, I think, in this shifting market that's worth noticing. And innovation solves a layer of problems and then creates a new layer nobody expected. Progress rarely moves in a clean, straight line towards being more simple. And Netflix's role in shaping the whole industry doesn't require pretending everything about that reshaping turned out perfectly. I want to ask a harder question here. One I kept circling back to while doing my research, because I don't think that this episode should just be the straightforward celebration of Netflix's adaptations. When a business removes friction from something, what behavior does that make easier, and is that behavior actually good for the people doing it? Removing friction is powerful for business, but not all friction is bad. Some friction protects your attention. Some friction creates a small pause that lets intention catch up with impulse before you act on it. Streaming removed almost all the friction from watching, which is convenient in the way it was designed to be, but it also makes it much easier to watch 3 more hours than you ever meant to. I don't think that's a reason to write off what Netflix built, though. It's a reason to think about what businesses actually do to people who use them. They don't just satisfy demand that was already sitting there waiting. They shape what gets demanded next, which connects to an idea that we talked about before through Clear. That environment drives behavior more than willpower does. If entertainment is instantly available, watching becomes the path of least resistance, and that's a design system. Not It's not like some sort of accident that these companies are making. The individual obviously still carries responsibility for making their own choices, but pretending that the system that these streaming services have created has no influence isn't really honest either. I actually want to bring this back to Hastings as a leader for a second, because I think one thing that stands out about him as a leader is how explicit he was willing to be about culture. A lot of leadership just leaves culture vague in hopes that personality and tradition fill in the gaps. Hastings treated culture as something that the leader should consciously design, which I think matters at a high level because every group develops a culture, whether anyone designs one on purpose or not. If nobody designs it deliberately, it forms out of whatever gets rewarded by default, whoever happens to be loudest in the room, whatever the leader does under stress. Netflix tried to make its culture explicit instead. Here's what we value, here's what we don't, here's exactly what we think about performance and feedback and freedom. And that clarity does something useful, I think, beyond just sounding good to outside people looking in. It lets people select what's important to them. Some people hear that description and immediately they like the competitive environment. Others hear that and know right away that I don't want to work at Netflix. And both of those reactions are useful because a vague culture tends to attract people under false expectations, while a clear one can let people choose with open eyes. That kind of clarity around what the actual deal is matters more than I think people think it does. Every team, school, company, relationship runs on some version of a deal. What's expected of you, what gets rewarded, what gets tolerated, what it costs you to be a part of it. A lot of conflict in these groups or these situations comes from that deal being hidden and not really known rather than stated explicitly. Someone joins a company believing loyalty matters most and discovers performance is what actually gets rewarded. Someone assumes creativity is valued and then discovers approval seeking is what actually gets promoted. When expectations are hidden like that, people end up feeling betrayed by something that nobody ever promised them. When they're stated plainly, even if the deal itself is demanding or some people might think it's unfair, people get to choose it with their eyes open, which I think is a form of respect. I also don't want to gloss over the emotional cost sitting inside Netflix's constant reinnovation because it comes from outside the Netflix story. The story reads like a clean success line, or I don't know how to put it exactly. DVDs to streaming to originals to global reach. Each step kind of sounds obvious in hindsight, but from inside the company, that kind of repeated reinvention of itself would probably feel more unsettling while it's happening. The skills that made someone valuable last year feel less central this year. The team that built the old model has to figure out where they belong in a new one. Resources get pulled away from a business people were proud of and redirected somewhere less proven. Customers complain during the transition. Investors get nervous. And for a while, leadership can look wrong before they eventually look right. Because the backlash to change always arrives faster than the benefit does in some way, shape, or form. That gap is actually where a lot of leaders retreat. They delay the move. They soften the move. They make it less different from their past. They protect the old model. And I think sometimes it's a fair instinct, I guess, to pull away from change. But sometimes it's just fear. And the hard part is knowing if you're fearing something or being cautious in the right way without having the benefit of hindsight. I think it's also almost impossible to tell the story of Netflix without putting Blockbuster next to it. And I think that the way that the comparison usually gets talked about is too neat. Because people say like something like, oh, Blockbuster was too foolish and Netflix was just smart. I think the real situation is more complicated than that. Big established companies carry real problems, and I guess maybe not problems, but rather constraints that some scrappy challenger doesn't have to deal with. They have existing revenue streams that can't be abandoned. They have investors who expect consistency. They have physical stores and franchise agreements and operational systems that are built for a different model. Blockbuster's massive footprint of physical locations was an advantage up until the moment that it became a burden. And Netflix's lack of physical locations was a weakness up until it was the whole advantage. I think that's one of the sharper strategic ideas sitting in this whole story. An advantage in one era can flip into a constraint in the next one without any of the underlying facts about the advantage actually changing. It's entirely about whatever the environment around it changes. A student who's naturally sharp might coast without ever building up real study habits, and that natural ability is an advantage right up until the material gets hard enough that habits start to matter more than just having talent. It's closer to something like fit, about which company or person happened to be built for the conditions that were coming next, which is, I think, honestly discomforting in some ways, because it means that today's strength might be tomorrow's constraint, and there's no way to know, like, at all, which one they'll turn out to be. I think the question of which one they'll turn out to be connects directly back to the idea of Andy Grove's strategic inflection point, a moment when the basic assumptions underneath the business stop being true, and the organization either shifts to meet this new reality, or starts to slowly decline until they're pretty much done for. Netflix, I think, hit several of those in a row. The arrival of streaming, the moment content owners realized they wanted to compete directly instead of licensing all to Netflix, the shift towards global competition on top of domestic competition. Each time, the company had to re-ask what business it was actually in. Was it a DVD company, a streaming technology company, a content company, a recommendation platform, an entertainment company, a global attention platform? The answer kept evolving, and I think that's actually one of the cleanest lessons in this whole story. Don't define yourself too narrowly by whatever your current method happens to be. If Netflix had permanently defined itself as a DVD by mail company, streaming would have looked like a direct threat to its own identity instead of becoming the next step for it. Because it stayed loyal to some deeper purpose, which was delivering entertainment conveniently, instead of the specific method it was using to do that at the time. Streaming then looked like an opportunity rather than an attack. Be loyal to your mission, not to your method, because the method is pretty much always going to be temporary, and the mission is what gives you a direction to move in once the method stops working. Satya Nadella actually went through a version of this exact same thing at Microsoft, where staying loyal to only Windows would have boxed the company in, but staying loyal to the broader idea about empowering people through technology or something like that left room for cloud computing and cross-platform tools to become the next chapter of Microsoft, without being a threat to the old one. I think there's also a genuine tension between data and creativity that Netflix had to live inside constantly, because entertainment isn't really just about a data product. It has taste, timing, risk, things that are hard to quantify in advance. Data can show you what people actually do as opposed to what they say they want, which is, I think it's valuable and it reduces uncertainty. But data can't predict culture before it happens, and it can't explain why a specific story feels alive or moving in a way that something similar to it might not. I think the lesson here is that the best use of data pairs it with judgment instead of replacing judgment with it. Because if a company only optimizes what's easy to measure, like viewing hours, completion rates, subscriber counts, it can drift away from the harder to measure things like trust, cultural impact, long-term brand meaning, that actually are a larger point of the company all along. I think that's a pattern, honestly, worth noticing beyond streaming platforms. Grades measure something real about learning without capturing all of it. Stats measure something about an athlete without capturing all of it. The risk is always mistaking the visible number for the whole truth because it's the part that's easiest to point to. By the time I got through all this research, I think the questions that I kept landing on were less about Netflix specifically, and more about the shape of the problem Hastings was solving. What am I still doing simply because it used to work, regardless of whether the environment around it has actually changed since? Where am I protecting a familiar method instead of actually serving the deeper mission it was supposed to be in service of? Where do I keep asking for more independence while avoiding the ownership that's supposed to come attached to it? Do I have people around me who will actually tell me the truth? And when they do I make that honestly feel worth the risk they took to offer it? Or do I punish it without meaning to? And maybe the sharpest one, the one that echoes Grove's question about Intel exactly, if someone with zero attachment to my current identity looks honestly at what I'm doing right now, What would they tell me to do? What would they tell me to let go of? And what am I actually willing to hear before reality eventually forces the answer on me anyways? I don't think constant reinvention like Netflix did is automatically the right posture for everything either. And it's worth saying that plainly, I think, in a couple words before closing this episode out. If you're always changing, you can honestly end up never building any real depth in anything. If you're always chasing whatever's next, you can neglect what's happening right now. Some things need stability instead of disruption. Some relationships need loyalty instead of constant renegotiation. Some environments need real process and safety instead of unlimited freedom. Netflix's model is a brilliant answer to a very specific question. How do you build a fast adapting company inside an industry that keeps changing underneath it? And it was never meant to be a universal answer by any means to any human problem that exists. I don't think the real skill that I've developed through this episode is copying Reed Hastings. It's understanding exactly what problem his approach was built to solve, and then asking whether that's the same problem sitting in front of you. Netflix shouldn't ever fully despise the DVD business left behind, since that business is what made everything that came after it possible in the first place. But I think gratitude for a past version of yourself isn't the same thing as loyalty to it. And you can honor what got you to where you are without letting it be the thing that decides where you go next. Your current habits, your current strengths, your current way of seeing yourself, none of that is final, no matter how much it feels like it might be your entire story right now. I think the real question that Hastings leaves us with is this. What do you need to let go of while it still looks and feels like success? Not because it was ever worthless, but because the future is asking for something else. And the only way to find out what that something else is paying close attention now before the answer gets made for you. Thanks for listening.